The least artificial extension of common knowledge is history. Personal recollection supplies many anecdotes collected and freely commented upon make up memoirs, and memoirs happily combined make not the least interesting story of history. When a man recalls any episode in his career, describes the men that flourished in his youth, or laments the changes that have since taken place, he is an informal historian. He would become one in a formal and technical sense if he supplemented and controlled his memory by ransacking papers and taking elaborate pains to gather evidence on the events he wished to relate. This systematic investigation, especially when it goes back to first sources, widens the basis for imaginative reconstruction. It buttresses somewhat the frail body of casual facts that in the first instance may have engaged an individual's attention. History is nothing but assisted and recorded memory. It might almost be said to be no science at all, if memory and faith in memory were not what science necessarily rests on. In order to sift evidence, we must rely on some witness, and we must trust experience before we proceed to expand it. The line between what is known scientifically and what has to be assumed in order to support that knowledge is impossible to draw. Memory itself is an internal rumor, and when to this hearsay within the mind we add the falsified echoes that reach us from others, we have but a shifting and unseizable basis to build upon. The picture we frame of the past changes continually and grows every day less similar to the original experience which it purports to describe. It is true that memory sometimes, as in a vision, seems to raise the curtain upon the past and restore it to us in its pristine reality. We may imagine at such moments that experience can never really perish, but, though hidden by chance from the roving eye, it endures eternally in some spiritual sphere. Such bodily recovery of the past, however, like other telepathic visions, can never prove its own truth. A lapse into bygone perception, a sense of living in the past over with all its vivid minutiae and trivial concomitants, might involve no true repetition of anything that had previously existed. It might be a fresh experience altogether. The sense of knowing constitutes only a working presumption for experiment to start with. Until corroboration comes, that presumption can claim no respect from the outsider. While memory remains a private presumption, therefore, it can be compared with nothing else that might test its veracity. Only when memory is expressed and, in the common field of expression, finds itself corroborated by another memory, does it rise somewhat in dignity and approach scientific knowledge. Two presumptions, when they coincide, make a double assurance. While memory, then, is the basis of all historical knowledge, it is not called history until it enters a field where it can be supported or corrected by evidence. This field is that natural world which all experiences, insofar as they are rational, envisage together. Assertions relating to events in that world can corroborate or contradict one another, something that would be impossible if each memory, like the plot of a novel, moved in a sphere of its own. For memory to meet memory, the two must present objects which are similar or continuous. Then they can corroborate or correct each other and help to fix the order of events as they really happened. That is, as they happened independently of what either memory may chance to claim. Thus, even the most miraculous and direct recovery of the past needs corroboration if it is to be to some event in nature. In that common world in space and time, to which other memories and perceptions may refer also. In becoming history, therefore, memory becomes a portion of natural science. Its assertions are such that Any natural science may conceivably support or contradict them. The consolidation of legend is not intentional. It is ingenious, and for the most part, inevitable. When we muse about our own past, we are conscious of no effort to give it dramatic unity. On the contrary, the excitement and interest in the process consist in seeming to discover the hidden eloquence and meaning of the events themselves. When a man of experience narrates the wonders he has seen, we listen with a certain awe and believe in him for his miracles, as we believe in our own memory for its arts. A bard's mechanical and ritualistic habits usually put all judgment on his own part to sleep, while the sanctity attributed to the tale, as it becomes automatically more impressive, precludes tinkering with it intentionally, especially the allegories and marvels with which early history is adorned are not ordinarily invented with malice prepense. They are rather discovered in the mind, like a foundling between night and morning. They are divinely vouchsafed. Each time the tale is retold, it suffers a variation which is not challenged, since it is memory itself that has varied. The change is discoverable only if some record of the narrative in its former guise, or some physical memorial of the event related, survives to be confronted with the modified version. The modified version itself can make no comparisons. It merely inherits the name and authority of its ancestor. The innocent poet believes his own lies. Legends consequently acquire considerable eloquence and dramatic force. These beauties accrue spontaneously, because rhythm and ideal pertinence, in which poetic merit largely lies, and ideal pertinence, in which poetic merit largely lies, are natural formative principles for speech and memory. As symmetry in material structures is a ground for strength, and hills by erosion are worn to pyramids, so it is in thoughts. Yet the stability attained is not absolute, but only such stability as the circumstances require. Dramatic effect is not everywhere achieved, nor is it missed by the narrator where it is wanting, so that even the oldest and best pruned legends are full of irrelevant survivals, contradictions, and scraps of nonsense. These literary blemishes are like embedded fossils and tell of facts which the mechanism of reproduction, for some casual reason, has not obliterated. The recorder of verbal tradition religiously sets down its inconsistencies and leaves in the transfigured chronicle many telltale incidents and remarks which, like atrophied organs in an animal body, reveal its gradual formation. Art and deliberate pursuit of unction or beauty would have thrown over this baggage. The automatic and pious minstrel carries it with him to the end. For these reasons, there can be no serious history until there are archives and preserved records. Although sometimes a man in a privileged position may compose interesting essays on the events and persons of his own time, as his personal experience has presented them to him. Archives and records, moreover, do not absolve a speculative historian from paying the same toll to the dramatic unities and making the same concessions to the laws of perspective which, in the absence of documents, turn tradition so soon into epic poetry. The principle that elicits histories out of records is the same that breeds legends out of remembered events. In both cases, the facts are automatically foreshortened and made to cluster, as it were, providentially, about a chosen interest. The historian's politics philosophy, or romantic imagination furnishes a vital nucleus for reflection. All that falls within that particular vortex is included in the mental picture. The rest is passed over and tends to drop out of sight. It is not possible to say, nor to think, everything at once. And the private interest which guides a man in selecting his materials imposes itself inevitably on the events he relates, and especially on their grouping and significance. History is always written wrong, and so always needs to be rewritten. The conditions of expression, and even of memory, dragoon the facts, and put a false front on diffuse experience. What is interesting is brought forward as if it had been central and efficacious in the march of events, and harmonies are turned into causes. Kings and generals are endowed with motives appropriate to what the historian values in their actions. Plans are imputed to them prophetic of their actual achievements, while the thoughts that really preoccupied them remain buried in absolute oblivion. Such falsification is inevitable, and an honest historian is guilty of it only against his will. He would wish, as he loves the truth, to see and render it entire. But the limits of his book and of his knowledge force him to be partial. It is only a very great mind, seasoned by large wisdom, that can lend such an accent and such a carrying power to a few facts as to make them representative of all reality. Some historians, indeed, are so frankly partisan or cynical that they avowedly write history with a view to effect, either political or literary. Moralizing historians belong to this school, as well as those philosophers who worship evolution. They sketch every situation with malice and twist it, as if it were an argument, to bring out a point, much as fashionable portrait painters sometimes surcharge the characteristic in order to make a bold effect at a minimum expense of time and devotion. And yet the truly memorable aspect of a man is that which he wears in the sunlight of common day, with all his genetic humanity upon him. His most interesting phase is not that which he might assume under the limelight of satirical or literary comparisons. The characteristic is, after all, inessential. It marks a peripheral variation in the honest and sturdy lump. To catch only the heartless shimmer of individuality is to paint a costume without the body that supports it. Therefore, a broad and noble historian sets down all within his apperception. His literary interests are forgotten. He is wholly devoted to expressing the passions of the dead. His ideal, emanating from his function, and chosen for no extraneous reason, is to make his heroes think and act as they really thought and acted in the world. We may conveniently distinguish in history, as it is perforce written by men, three distinct elements, which we may call historical investigation, historical theory, and historical romance. Historical investigation is the natural science of the past. The circumstance that its documents are usually literary may somewhat disguise the physical character and the physical principles of this science. But when a man wishes to discover what really happened at a given moment, even if the event were somebody's thought, he has to read his sources, not for what they say, but for what they imply. In other words, the witnesses cannot be allowed merely to speak for themselves, and after the gossiping fashion familiar in Herodotus, their testimony has to be interpreted according to the laws of evidence. The past needs to be reconstructed out of reports, as in geology or archaeology. It needs to be reconstructed out of stratifications and ruins. A man's memory, or the report in the newspaper, is a fact justifying certain inferences about its probable causes, according to laws which such phenomena betray in the present when they are closely scrutinized. This reconstruction is often very difficult, and sometimes all that can be established in the end is merely that the tradition before us is certainly false. Somewhat as a perplexed geologist might venture on no conclusion except that the state of the Earth's crust was once very different from what it is now. A natural science dealing with the past labors under the disadvantage of not being able to appeal to experiment. The facts it terminates upon cannot be recovered, so that they may verify, in sense, the hypothesis that had inferred them. The hypothesis can be tested only by current events. It is then turned back upon the past to give assurance of facts which themselves are hypothetical and remain hanging, as it were, to the loose end of the hypothesis itself. A hypothetical fact is a most dangerous creature, since it lives on the credit of a theory, which in turn would be bankrupt if the fact should fail. Inferred past facts are more deceptive than facts prophesied, because while the risk of error in the inference is the same, there is no possibility of discovering that error, and the historian, while really as speculative as the prophet, can never be found out. Most facts are known to man, however, are reached by inference, and their reality may be wisely assumed so long as the principle by which they are inferred, when it is applied in the present, finds complete and constant verification. Presumptions involved in memory and tradition give the first hypothetical facts we count upon. The relations which these first facts betray supply the laws by which facts are to be concatenated, and these laws may then be used to pass from the first hypothetical facts to hypothetical facts of a second order, forming a background and congruous extension to those originally assumed. This expansion of discursive science can go on forever, unless indeed the principles of inference employed in it involve some present existence, such as a skeleton in a given tomb, which direct experience fails to verify. Then the theory itself is disproved, and the whole galaxy of hypothetical facts which clustered about it forfeit their credibility. The profit of studying history lies in something else than in a dead knowledge of what happens to have happened. A seductive alternative might be to say that the profit of it lies in understanding what has happened, in perceiving the principles and laws that govern social evolution, or the meaning which events have. We are hereby launched upon a region of physio-ethical speculation, where any man with a genius for quick generalization can swim at ease. To find the one great cause why Rome fell, especially if no one has ever thought of it before, or to expound the true import of the French Revolution, or the formula in limpid sentences, the essence of Greek culture. What could be more tempting, or more purely literary? It would ill become the author of this book to decry allegorical expressions, or a cavalier-like fashion of dismissing whole periods and tendencies with a verbal antithesis. We must have exercises in apperception. A work in imagination must be taken imaginatively, and a landscape painter must be suffered to be, at his own risk, as impressionistic as he will. If Raphael, when he was designing the school of Athens, had said to himself that Aristotle should point down to a fact and Plato up to a meaning, or when designing the Disputa, had conceived that the proudest of intellects, weary of argument and learning, should throw down his books and turn to revelation for guidance, there would have been much historical pertinence in those conceptions, yet the figures would have been allegorical, contracting into a decorative design events that have been dispersed through centuries and emotions that had only cropped up here and there, with all manner of variations and alloys, when the particular natural situation had made them inevitable. So the Renaissance might be spoken of as a person, and the Reformation as her stepsister, and something might be added about the troubles of their home life. But would it be needful in that case to enter a warning that these units were verbal merely, and that the phenomena and forces really at work have been multitudinous and infinitesimal. In fine, historical terms mark merely rhetorical unities which have no dynamic cohesion, and there are no historical laws which are not at bottom physical, like the laws of habit, those expressions of Newton's first law of motion. An essayist may play with historical apperception as long as he will, and always find something new to say, discovering the ideal nerve and issue of a movement in a different aspect of the facts. The truly proportionate, constant, efficacious relations between things will remain material. Physical causes traverse the moral units at which history stops, determining their force and duration, and the order so relevant to intent in which they succeed one another. Even the single man's life and character have subterranean sources. How should the outer expression and influence of that character have sources more superficial than its own? Yet we cannot trace moral development down to the more stable units composing a personal organism, much less, therefore, to those composing a complex social evolution. We accordingly translate the accidents, obviously lurking under life's commonplace yet unaccountable shocks, into verbal principles, names for general impressive results that play some role in our ideal philosophy. Each of these idols of the theater is visible only on a single stage and to duly predisposed spectators. The next passion affected will throw a differently colored light on the same pageant, and there will be no end of rival evolutions and incompatible ideal principles crossing one another at every interesting event. Such manipulation of history, when made by persons who underestimate their imaginative powers, ends in asserting that events have directed themselves prophetically upon the interests which they arouse. Apart from the magic involved in this mockery of all science, there is difficulty here which even a dramatic idealist ought to feel. The interests affected are themselves many and contrary. If history is to be understood teleologically, which of all the possible ends it might be pursuing shall we think really endowed with regressive influence and responsible for the movement that is going to realize it? Did Columbus, for instance, discover America so that George Washington might exist, or that someday football and the Church of England may prevail throughout the world? Or was it, as has been seriously maintained, in order that the converted Indians of South America might console St. Peter for the defection of the British and Germans? Or was America, as Hegel believed, ideally superfluous, the absolute having become self-conscious enough already in Prussia? Or shall we say that the real goal is an infinite distance and unimaginable by us, and useless, therefore, for understanding anything? There is a sense, of course, in which definite political plans and moral aspirations may well be fulfilled by events. Our ancestors, sharing and anticipating our natures, may have had in many respects our actual interests in view, as we may have those of posterity. Such ideal cooperation extends far where primary interests are concerned. It is rarer and more qualified where a fine and fragile organization is required to support the common spiritual life. Even in these cases, the aim pursued and attained is not the force that operates, since the result achieved had many other conditions besides the worker's intent, and that intent itself had causes which it knew nothing of. Every historical force, pompously appealed to, breaks up on inspection into a cataract of miscellaneous natural processes and minute particular causes. It breaks into its mechanical constituents and proves to have nothing but an effet d'ensemble produced on a mind whose habits and categories are essentially rhetorical. This sort of false history or philosophy of history might be purified, like so many other things, by self-knowledge. If the philosopher in reviewing events confessed that he was scrutinizing them in order to abstract from them whatever tended to illustrate his own ideals, as he might look over a crowd to find his friends, the operation would become a perfectly legitimate one. The events themselves would be left for scientific inference to discover, where credible reports did not testify to them directly, and the causes of events would be left to some theory of natural evolution, to be stated according to the degree of knowledge attained in terms more and more exact and mechanical. In the presence of the past, so defined, imagination and will, however, would not abdicate their rights, and a sort of retrospective politics, an estimate of events in reference to the moral ideal which they embodied or betrayed, might supervene upon positive history. This estimate of evolution might well be called a philosophy of history, since it would be a higher operation performed on the results of natural science, to give a needful basis and illustration to the chosen ideal. The present work is an essay in that direction. The ideal, which in such a review would serve as a touchstone for estimation, if it were an enlightened ideal, would recognize its own natural basis, and therefore would also recognize that under other conditions other ideals, no less legitimate, may have arisen and may have been made the standard for a different judgment on the world. Historical investigation, were its resources adequate, would reveal to us what these various ideals have been. Every animal has his own, and whenever individuals or nations have become reflective, they have known how to give articulate expressions to theirs. That all these ideals could not have been realized in turn or together is an immense misfortune, the irremediable half-tragedy of life for which we also suffer. In estimating the measure of success achieved anywhere, a liberal historian, who does not wish to be bluntly irrational, will of course estimate it from all these points of view, considering all real interests affected, insofar as he can appreciate them. This is what is meant by putting the standard of value, not in some arbitrary personal dogma, but in a variegated, omnipresent happiness. It is by no means requisite, therefore, in disentangling the life of reason, to foresee what ultimate form the good might some day take, much less to make the purposes of the philosopher himself, his time, or his nation, the test of all excellence. This test is the perpetual concomitant ideal of the life it is applied to, as all could not be well in the world if my own purposes were defeated, so the general excellence of things would be heightened if other men's purposes also have been fulfilled. Each will is a true center for universal estimation. As each will, therefore, comes to expression, real and irreversible values are introduced into the world, and the historian, in estimating what has been hitherto achieved, needs to make himself the spokesman for all past aspirations. If the Egyptian poets sang well, though that conduces not at all to our advantage, and though all those songs are now dumb, the life of reason was thereby increased once for all, in pith and volume. Brief, erratic experiments made in living, if they were somewhat successful in their day, remain successes always, and this is the only kind of success that in the end can be achieved at all. The philosopher who looks for what is good in history and measures the past by the scale of reason need be no impertinent dogmatist on that account. Reason would not be reason but passion if it did not make all passions and all creatures constituents of its own authority. The judgments it passes on existence or only the judgments which existence, so far, has passed on itself, and these are indelible and have their proportionate weight, though others of many different types may surround or succeed them. To inquire what everybody has thought about the world, and into what strange shapes every passionate dream would fain have transformed existence, might be merely a part of historical investigation. These facts of preference and estimation might be made to stand side by side with all other facts in that absolute physical order which the universe must somehow possess. In the reference book of science, they would all find their page and line, but it is not for the sake of making vain knowledge complete that historians are apt to linger over heroic episodes and commanding characters in the world's annals. It is not even in the hope of discovering just to what extent and in how many directions experience has been a tragedy. The mathematical balance of failure and success, even if it could be drawn with accuracy, would not be a truth of moral importance, since whatever that balance might be for the world at large, success and benefit here, from a living point of view, would be equally valid and delightful. And however good or however bad the universe may be, it is always worthwhile to make it better. What engages the historian in the reconstruction of moral life, such as the past contained, is that he finds in that life many an illustration of his own ideals, or even a necessary stimulus in defining what his ideals are. Where his admiration and his sympathy are awakened, he sees noble aims and great achievements, worthy of being minutely studied and brought vividly before later generations. Very probably, he will be led by moral affinities with certain phases of the past to attribute to those phases in their abstraction, and by virtue of their moral dignity, a material efficacy which they did not really have, and his interest in history's moral will make him turn history itself into a fable. This abuse may be abated, however, by having recourse to impartial historical investigation that will restore to the hero all his circumstantial evidence, and to the glorious event all its insignificant causes. Certain men and certain episodes will retain, notwithstanding, their intrinsic nobility, and the historian, who is often a politician and a poet rather than a man of science, will dwell on those noble things so as to quicken his own sense for greatness, and to burnish in his soul ideals that may have remained obscure for want of scrutiny, or may have been tarnished by too much contact with the sordid world. History, so conceived, has the function of epic or dramatic poetry. The moral life represented may actually have been lived through, but the circumstance is incidental, merely, and what makes the story worth telling is its pertinence to the political or emotional life of the present. To revive past moral experience is indeed well nigh impossible unless the living will can still covet or dread the same issues. Historical romance cannot be truthful or interesting when profound changes have taken place in human nature. The reported acts and sentiments of early peoples lose their tragic dignity in our eyes when they lose their pertinence to our own aims, so that a recital of history with an eye to its dramatic values is possible only when that history is, so to speak, our own, or when we assimilate it to ours by poetic license. The various functions of history have been generally carried on simultaneously, and with little consciousness of their profound diversity. Since historical criticism made its appearance, the romantic interest in the past, far from abating, has fed eagerly on all the material incidents and private gossip of remote times. This sort of petty historical drama has reflected contemporary interests, which have centered so largely in material possessions and personal careers, while at the same time it has kept pace with the knowledge of minutiae attained by archaeology. When historical investigation has reached its limits, a period of ideal reconstruction may very likely set in. Indeed, were it possible to collect in archives exhaustive accounts of everything that has ever happened, so that the curious man might always be informed on any point of fact that interested him, historical imagination might grow free again in its movements, not being suspected of wishing to distort facts which could so easily be pointed to. It might become more conscious of its own moral function, and it might turn unblushingly to what was important and inspiring in order to put it with dramatic force before the mind. Such a treatment of history would reinstate that epic and tragic poetry which has become obsolete. It might well be written in verse, and would at any rate be frankly imaginative. It might furnish a sort of ritual with scientific and political sanctions for public feasts. Tragedies and epics are such only in name if they do not deal with the highest interests and destinies of a people, and they could hardly deal with such ideals in an authoritative and definite way unless they found them illustrated in that people's traditions. Historic romance is a work of art, not of science, and its fidelity to past fact is only an expedient, often an excellent and easy one, for striking the key note of present ideals. The insight attained, even when it is true insight into what someone else felt in some other age, draws its force and sublimity from current passions potential in the auditor's soul. Mary, Queen of Scots, for instance, doubtless repeated in many a fancied dialogue with Queen Elizabeth the very words that Schiller puts into her mouth in the central scene of his play, Den ich bin euer König. Yet the dramatic force of that expression, its audacious substitution of ideals for facts, depends entirely on the scope which we lend it. Different actors and different readers would interpret it differently. Some might see in it nothing but a sally in a woman's quarrel, reading it with the accent of mere spite and irritation. Then the tragedy, not perhaps without historic truth, will be reduced to a loud comedy. Other interpreters might find in the phrase the whole feudal system, all the chivalry, legality, and foolishness of the Middle Ages. Then the drama will become more interesting, and the poor queen's cry, while that of a mind sophisticated and fanatical, would have been great pathos and keenness. To reach sublimity, however, that moment would have to epitomize ideals which we deeply respected. We should have to believe in the sanctity of canon law and in the divine right of primogeniture. That a woman may have been very unhappy, or that a state may have been held together by personal allegiance, does not raise the fate of either to a tragic plane, unless laws that are not of today nor yesterday, aspirations native to the heart, shine through those legendary misfortunes. It would matter nothing to the excellence of Schiller's drama which of these interpretations might have been made by Mary Stuart herself at any given moment. Doubtless her attitude toward her rival was colored on different occasions by varying degrees of political insight and moral fervor. The successful historical poet would be he who caught the most significant attitude which a person in that situation could possibly have assumed, and his Mary Stuart, whether accidentally resembling the real woman or not, would be essentially a mythical person. So Electra, and Antigone, and Helen of Troy are tragic figures absolved from historical accuracy. Although possibly, if the personages of heroic times were known to us, we might find that our highest imagination had been anticipated in their pride. Of the three parts into which the pursuit of history may be divided, investigation, theory, and storytelling, not one attains ideal finality. Investigation is merely useful, because its intrinsic ideal, to know every detail of everything, is not rational, and its acceptable function can only be to offer accurate information upon such points as are worth knowing for some ulterior reason. Historical theory, in turn, is a falsification of causes, since no causes are other than automatic. It is an arbitrary foreshortening of physics, and it dissolves in the presence either of adequate knowledge or of clear ideals. Finally, historical romance passes, as it grows mature, into epics and tragedies, where the moral imagination disengages itself from all allegiance to particular past facts. Thus, history proves to be an imperfect field for the exercise of reason. It is a provisional discipline. Its values, with the mind's progress, would empty into higher activities. The function of history is to lend materials to politics and to poetry. These arts need to dominate past events, the better to dominate the present situation and the ideal one. A good book of history is one that helps the statesman to formulate and to carry out his plans, or that helps the tragic poet to conceive what is most glorious in human destiny. Such a book, as knowledge and ignorance are now mingled, will have to borrow something from each of the methods by which history is commonly pursued. Investigation will be necessary, since the needful facts are not all indubitably known. Theory will be necessary too, so that those facts may be conceived in their pertinence to public interests, and the latter may thereby be clarified. And romance will not be wholly excluded, because the various activities of the mind about the same matter cannot be divided altogether, and that dramatic treatment is often useful in summarizing a situation, when all the elements of it cannot be summed up in detail before the mind. Fragmentary, arbitrary, and insecure as historical conceptions must remain, they are nevertheless highly important. In human consciousness, the indispensable is an inverse ratio to the demonstrable. Sense is the foundation of everything. Without sense, memory would be both false and useless. Yet memory, rather than sense, is knowledge in the pregnant acceptation of the word. For in sense, object and process are hardly distinguished, whereas in memory, significance inheres in the datum, and the present vouches for the absent. Similarly, history, which is derived from memory, is superior to it, for while it merely extends memory artificially, it shows a higher logical development than memory has and is riper for ideal uses. Trivial and useless matter has dropped out, inference has gone a step further, thought is more largely representative, and testimony conveyed by the reports of others or found in monuments leads the speculative mind to infer events that must have filled the remotest ages. This information is not passive or idle knowledge. It truly informs or shapes the mind, giving it new aptitudes, as an efficacious memory modifies instinct by leveling it with a wider survey of the situation. So a memory of what human experience has been, a sense of what is likely to be under specific circumstances, gives the will a new basis. Great interests are a gift which history makes to the heart.